I'm Claire and welcome to my channel. So today's video is who makes your fragrances. I made this video around 4 or 5 years ago on my channel and I just thought I'd make a new version because things change over time. Brands change hands, brands disappear even from the fragrance market or even reappear in the fragrance market. I just thought it needed an update. So some people will be really familiar with how the designer fragrance world works and others won't. So there are really about 4 or 5 ingredient companies that supply ingredients to conglomerates who then manufacture the perfumes themselves. So large perfume conglomerate companies either own the fragrance brands themselves directly as a result of even owning the entire designer brand. Sometimes it's just they own the fragrance part of the brand, or sometimes, and actually this is more common, they own the perfume license. So they have the license to create the fragrances for that brand. Different perfume conglomerates work on different business models. But of course, these brand licenses expire, brands get sold, so things change over time. So what I'm going to talk about in this video is essentially which conglomerate brand owns the license or the brand of each designer fragrance house. There are, of course, some independent brands, but those are particularly rare, and I will talk about those right at the end of the video. So if you've not seen me before, I'm Claire. I talk all about fragrance on this channel. I make videos all about perfume history, perfume science, and I also just love reviewing fragrances, and I also love doing perfume tags as well. So if that kind of thing interests you and you haven't already subscribed, then please do consider subscribing. And please, if you do enjoy this video, then please do press the like button. So just before I start listing all of these companies, why is this information useful to us? Well, I don't know whether you've ever smelt a flanker fragrance, for example, and thought, this really reminds me of another flanker fragrance from a totally different brand, and perhaps have wondered why. I definitely have. And I think this is something that you smell particularly with L'Oreal brand fragrances. I think some fragrance brands almost lose their identity a little when they join a big conglomerate brand. And that can mean that there can be overlaps in the styles of the fragrance brands. This kind of information can be useful to the consumer because sometimes you may really appreciate one particular fragrance brand, but you might want that fragrance brand at a lower price. And actually knowing which other brands a conglomerate owns may provide you with opportunities to try fragrances at lower price points that you may still really enjoy. It's much like with conglomerates that own makeup or skincare. You can often find a bargain by knowing which brands are owned by the same company. And just as an aside, you may also be sitting there and thinking, well, if all these designer brands are not actually involved in making their own fragrances, then what is the point for them? And the point for them is really that the fragrance business is incredibly lucrative. So if they sell a license to another brand to make fragrances, or if they sell their fragrance business itself, then they can make a lot of money from doing that. Fragrance brands are going to want to be in that market, and fragrance manufacture is expensive. You need specialist equipment, and handing that to another brand to just take care of is going to make a lot of financial sense because that setup is going to be an enormous hill of cost to climb before that brand would ever make a profit. Marketing fragrances is also a way to introduce a new customer base to a particular designer brand, and that can be a gateway to customers purchasing higher value items. So for example, how many people may have started off buying fragrances from a brand when they were younger, when they had less money, and then perhaps in their 30s, 40s, 50s, end up buying handbags or even a designer piece of clothing. It's a way for the fragrance brand to get brand recognition and to gain a larger customer base. So next we're going to look at the big perfume conglomerates in the market. So I'm going to look at each one and I'm going to try and give you an idea of their revenue, to give you an idea of their relative sizes. I'm going to start off with the largest companies, the most well-known ones that you probably all know about, and then I'll go down to the smaller companies and perhaps give you an idea of the up-and-coming companies, the challenger companies that are really turning the market on its head. So first up, very predictably, I'm going to look at L'Oreal. So L'Oreal are a huge player in the global fragrance market. So L'Oreal fragrances are actually part of the L'Oreal Luxe end of the business. And L'Oreal Luxe accounts for 35% of L'Oreal's entire revenue. In 2025, they reported a revenue of 15.6 billion euros. And L'Oreal said that overall, fragrance makes up 15% of their entire business. So from that revenue figure, we can estimate that fragrance is around 7 billion euros per year. L'Oreal works by both buying brands and also controlling licenses for other brands, usually on a very long-term basis. So you may be familiar with some of the brands that L'Oreal actually own. So the oldest example would be something like Lancôme. They've owned that one since the 60s. In more recent years, they've bought additional brands. So they bought YSL back in 2008. And then in 2020, they bought Mugler and also Azzaro from Clarins. L'Oreal has licenses to make fragrances for a huge number of brands, a really wide portfolio. And those brands include Ralph Lauren, Giorgio Armani, Valentino, Prada, Miu Miu, Diesel, Maison Margiela and Viktor and Rolf. Only this year, L'Oreal obtained new licenses from Kering. So Kering are a kind of private finance equity kind of group. So Kering have recently bought Creed, and that's one of the licenses that L'Oreal has now bought from Kering. But interestingly, L'Oreal have also bought the licenses to make fragrances for Balenciaga. So you may see a greater range of fragrances coming from that brand, and also Bottega Veneta. L'Oreal will also take control of Gucci, taking over the brand from Coty from next year. And this has been a huge deal for L'Oreal and also a huge deal for Coty. Coty have actually been compensated for giving up their license a whole year early, and the overall deal with Kering is worth around $4 billion. So this is really huge money that's involved in buying these licenses, huge money in the fragrance industry. And you can just see how L'Oreal are keen to pick up those more prestigious designer brands. As part of this huge deal with Kering, L'Oreal have also obtained a minority stake in the niche brand Matière Première. The new leases will run for 50 years, so L'Oreal are not playing here. They want these brands under their portfolio for the long term. So next up we have LVMH. So LVMH have a slightly different business model to L'Oreal. LVMH really focus on buying fragrance houses rather than licensing. And actually, because LVMH is a big part of the fashion industry as well, it often owns the entire designer brand, rather than just the fragrance arm. From LVMH's point of view, this makes complete sense because if fragrance is the gateway to introducing a customer to a particular brand, they will want to really control the brand image and to really make the most of that potential. So the brands owned by LVMH include, very famously, of course, Dior, and that's really its bread and butter business. That's where the majority of its income comes from. They, of course, also bought Guerlain from the Guerlain family back in 1994, and they bought Givenchy back in 1988. They also own Kenzo Parfums, which they obtained in 1993, Loewe, that they obtained in 1996, Acqua di Parma in 2001, and of course very famously Maison Francis Kurkdjian that they obtained in 2017 when Kurkdjian and his business partner agreed a deal with LVMH. The brand also owned Bully, which is a brand that I hadn't heard of until I started researching for this video. They obtained them back in 2021. And they also have a 50% stake in Fenty Beauty, which they've been trying to offload. But I did notice recently that Fenty have gone into the world of fragrance mist. They always had their original fragrance, even though they're more of a skincare and makeup brand. But I do wonder whether we're going to see more fragrances from Fenty. LVMH also have minority shares in BDK and also very famously Hermes. So at one point, LVMH did attempt a hostile takeover of Hermes, but Hermes resisted and LVMH have since backed off. LVMH records a revenue based on both cosmetics and perfume grouped together. So that revenue was listed last year as around 8.2 billion euros. So whilst this figure does not refer solely to perfume, it does give us an idea of their size in the market, and it is likely that the bulk of that revenue is really down to fragrance. As I said before, Dior are their powerhouse. They are the ones that make a lot of profit for them, and that's really down to them having fragrances like Dior Sauvage, which is notoriously the world's best-selling men's fragrance. So next up we have a brand that I think gets a little bit overlooked. So this is the Spanish Catalan brand. Perhaps it gets overlooked because it's really hard to say. If you're not Catalan, then this looks like a certain word, but actually when you say it, it sounds completely different to English speakers. So I think it's pronounced Puig, I think. Don't quote me on that. So Puig are a brand that really has a very diverse portfolio. And what they tend to do is they first will buy the fragrance brand from a designer brand, and then they will slowly actually buy the rest of the designer brand as well. So this brand's first acquisition was really Paco Rabanne all the way back in 1968. And it bought the entire business, including the fashion arm, in 1987. That same year it obtained Carolina Herrera, and it released the first fragrance for Carolina Herrera in 1988. Also in the 80s it obtained Nina Ricci, and then in the 2000s it obtained Jean Paul Gaultier, which I think it got from Shiseido. More recently it's moved into more of the pseudo-niche fragrance world, so you will notice that its later acquisitions are really of more luxurious feeling brands. So in 2015 they bought Penhaligon's. The British brand is not British owned, it's owned by the Spanish Catalan company, and they also bought L'Artisan Parfumeur. In 2018 they obtained a Christian Louboutin beauty license, and they have been producing fragrances and beauty products for them. And they also bought a majority share in Dries Van Noten, launching their very successful fragrance range, very well done fragrance range, a few years later. And in 2022, they bought a majority share in Byredo. So that gives this brand a huge range, all the way from best-selling, designer fragrances such as 1 Million, all the way into those kind of niche brands such as Byredo and Penhaligon's. So the brand reported their fragrance and fashion segment last year generated revenue of 3.6 billion euros. So whilst this is fashion and fragrance, the brand reports that fashion makes up less than 5% of that revenue. So we can estimate that they had approximately 3.5 billion euros of fragrance revenue in 2025. Of the top 10 best-selling fragrance brands around the world, this brand owns 3 of the top 10. So they have Carolina Herrera, Rabanne, and also Jean Paul Gaultier. So despite being one of the lesser well-known names, they actually sell an enormous amount of fragrance. So next up is Coty. So Coty is another interesting one because it's really been going through a lot of changes this year, and it will go through a lot of changes next year, especially when it loses that license for Gucci to L'Oreal. Gucci is really the star of Coty's crown. It's the biggest part of their fragrance business. And I just wonder what's going to happen to Coty in the future without Gucci. So Coty has been a player in the fragrance world for a long time, and it even markets fragrances under its own brand name. But historically, Coty had a lot of celebrity fragrance brands, and I think with the kind of changes in the market with Middle Eastern fragrances coming in, I think Coty has suffered because celebrity fragrances are no longer as popular as perhaps they once were. So in 2016, Coty actually merged with Procter & Gamble Beauty, and that really gave it a huge number of licenses for big brands and made the business much bigger. So that was when they got Gucci, Hugo Boss, Escada, Mex, Stella McCartney and Alexander McQueen. But if you know anything about the current fragrance market, you will know that a few of those brands no longer market fragrances. So separately in 2017, Coty obtained a license to make Burberry's fragrances, and it still does that today. That deal was worth £130 million. And actually, just in that first financial year alone, Burberry's beauty business generated revenue of £203 million. So you can see how lucrative owning that license is to a conglomerate brand. So Coty also controls a number of other brands, including most famously brands such as Marc Jacobs, Chloe, Calvin Klein, Davidoff, Jill Sander, Jupe or Yoop or Yop or whatever you want to call it, Etro, Marni, Swarovski and Tiffany & Co. I think it's interesting with Coty how Coty have really stuck to the middle ground of the market. Fragrance over the last few years has been polarising. It's been going either towards the more expensive end of the market that's been expanding or the much more affordable end of the market that's been expanding. The middle ground has suffered somewhat. And I do wonder whether that strategy is perhaps not doing Coty too many favours right now. So Coty is a brand that I can't really give you a revenue figure for, but really as a brand, Coty is enormous and fragrance is its defining category. Coty describe themselves as a global fragrance leader. So I would imagine they're around number 4 or number 5 on this list currently, but after they lose Gucci next year, who knows? Okay, so next up is another huge company that you will all have heard of. So this one is Estée Lauder. So Estée Lauder, of course, is an enormous fragrance owner, but also they market lots of other products. Its fragrance portfolio includes brands such as Jo Malone, Le Labo, Tom Ford, Kilian, Frederic Malle, Estée Lauder itself and the sister brand Erin, Clinique, Aramis and Balmain. So we can see from this list of brands that Estée Lauder have essentially concentrated on higher end offerings. They have gone for basically buying up niche brands. So this really began back in around 1999 when Estée Lauder showed interest in Jo Malone. And very famously, more recently, Estée Lauder have been suing Jo Malone for using her own name on Zara fragrances because Estée Lauder bought the rights to use Jo Malone's name on fragrances, and that's why there is that dispute going on. So I'm interested to see the outcome of that case, but clearly Estée Lauder protect their intellectual property rights very closely. So Estée Lauder obtained Le Labo back in 2014 and they bought Frederic Malle in 2015 and Kilian in 2016. With lots of the brands, initially Estée Lauder usually agree to the founder staying on with the brand, and it seems to me that eventually the founders tend to abandon the businesses. And of course we don't know why this is. We don't know whether it's, just they want to go do something else or whether there's some kind of artistic disagreement. We'll never know. But I just think that's an interesting pattern that I've noticed with Estée Lauder. So in 2023, Estée Lauder bought Tom Ford's fragrance brand, but now they are effectively the beauty business operator for the beauty side of the brand. So Estée Lauder fragrance sales for 2025 are recorded as around $2.5 billion. But in only the first 9 months of the 2025-2026 financial year, Estée Lauder have reported revenue of $2.1 billion. So clearly for this year, they're on target to make around 10 to 12% extra compared with last year. So given the number of brands and the number of high-end brands that Estée Lauder actually operate, this figure may appear to be a little bit low, but you have to remember that sales for higher priced brands are generally lower. Brands also have more restricted availability, which limits their exposure to customers and also reduces their overall sales. So next up is a brand again that people tend to forget about, and this one's called Interparfums. So Interparfums actually make lots of different designer fragrance brands, and the biggest of these are really things like Jimmy Choo, Coach, Montblanc, Montclair, Lacoste, which the brand took over from Coty being the original licensee, Karl Lagerfeld, Kate Spade, Van Cleef & Arpels, Boucheron, Longchamp, Goutal and Off-White. And actually Interparfums even owns Lanvin and Rochas. So most of Interparfums' business is based on licensing, but clearly it does own two brands. And interestingly for us, Interparfums are a brand that break down their individual revenue streams by individual fragrance brands. So we can see their biggest players. And we can see that 2/3 of their €900 million revenue is made up of just 3 of their brands in their portfolio. And those brands are Jimmy Choo, Coach and Montblanc. So next we have another conglomerate brand called Euroitalia. So this has several licensed brands, and this includes some famous Italian fashion houses, as you might expect from a business called Euroitalia. So they have Versace, Moschino, Missoni, D Squared, the British heritage brand Atkinson 1799 and Michael Kors. So revenue-wise for Euroitalia, I don't have a value for their revenue that's based entirely on just fragrance. I just have an overall value. But you can think of Euroitalia as mainly being a fragrance brand. So the likelihood is the bulk of this revenue is going to be due to their fragrance income. So their reported revenue back in 2024 was €724 million. So next up we have Shiseido. So Shiseido are again a brand you might know. If you've been in the fragrance world for a while, you might remember fragrances such as Shiseido Zen. But I feel nowadays Shiseido are thought of more as perhaps an overall beauty brand, perhaps more about skincare and makeup than they are about fragrance. And I feel like that's been a move they've been making for a while. I think they've been shifting their position in the market and maybe offloading a few fragrance brands that weren't as profitable as other brands. So the current brands include Issey Miyake, Narciso Rodriguez, Serge Lutens, and also Zadig and Voltaire. They did also used to operate Dolce & Gabbana and also Jean-Paul Gaultier, but they've lost those licenses. So as for their revenue figure, I don't have an overall revenue figure for their entire brand or their entire fragrance portfolio. But for the 2 biggest fragrance brands, which are of course Issey Miyake and Narciso Rodriguez, they had revenue of around €300 million last year. So next we have a smaller group of brands that I think have shrunk recently because of the decreasing interest in celebrity brands, and also because they have recently lost perhaps their biggest celebrity brand, which is Britney Spears. So I'm talking about Revlon, or sometimes they're referred to as Elizabeth Arden. So Elizabeth Arden, of course, are a huge perfume company just in their own right. They market lots of fragrances. They call these fragrances their heritage fragrances, and they are said to make up around 61% of their revenue streams. So fragrances such as green tea, white tea, sunflowers, Fifth Avenue, bluegrass, are what makes up the bulk of the revenue for the business. But actually, historically, it also was associated with licenses for All Saints, La Perla, Juicy Couture, John Vivatos, and celebrity brands such as Christina Aguilera, Jennifer Aniston, Mariah Carey, and brands such as Giorgio Beverly Hills and Curve. So back in 2022, they reported their fragrance revenue as around $345 million. However, back in 2022, this figure would have included revenue for Britney Spears fragrances, which they no longer control. So let's next move on to Give Back Beauty, who now actually have that license for Britney Spears fragrances. So you may remember the legal dispute a few years ago over the process of transferring the license when Elizabeth Arden's 10-year license ran out on Britney Spears fragrances. And Give Back Beauty were being sued by Elizabeth Arden Revlon. And I think eventually they settled out of court to avoid costly court cases going on. But it was a right mess, basically. And new releases from Britney Spears went on a complete hiatus while they sorted out this legal mess. So Give Back Beauty are really a rising star in the perfume market. They've actually taken a lot of licenses from different perfume conglomerates over the last few years, and they've really grown to have quite a sizable portfolio of brands. I didn't actually realise just how big Give Back Beauty are until I started researching for this video, and I was really quite shocked because I don't really feel like, when I made this video 4 or 5 years ago, they were anywhere really at all on the fragrance market. It just seems to have come out of nowhere, Give Back Beauty. So the brand controls licenses for Zegna, also Chopard, Elle Saab, Tommy Hilfiger, Mercedes-Benz, Philippe Plein, Iceberg, but really their star brand is Dolce & Gabbana. They also control Billie Eilish, Florence by Mills, and Trussardi. So Give Back Beauty generated a revenue of around 300 million euros back in 2024, and they report that approximately 70% of this revenue came from fragrance. So we can estimate that around 210 million euros was the revenue just from fragrance. I think with Give Back Beauty, they're a brand to watch, and I think they're going to become an ever bigger player in the fragrance market. They are not afraid to be competitive when bidding for licenses, and I can see them expanding further in the fragrance market. Interestingly, the brand also do distribution for other brands. So for example, they distribute a lot of L'Oreal brands such as Viktor and Rolf, and I think that also is helping to grow their business. So just to finish off, there are some smaller groups and then there are some independent brands as well, which I've kind of already slightly touched on. But I think one that's important to mention is Art Essence, which is a brand that was formed to encompass Initio and also Parfums de Marly. So those two brands are co-owned by the original founder and also by a kind of private equity firm called Advent International. We then also have the smaller groups. So for example, the Lilique Group, which operates licenses for Jaguar, Bentley, Grey, Alain Delon and Samurai. So then finally we have the independent brands. And of course the one that I think most people would think of would be Chanel. They always like to do their own thing. And also one people might not think of is Hermès. So I think both of those brands really stand out because they do have a very distinctive house feel. And I think you can always smell a fragrance and think that's a Chanel fragrance, or you can always smell an Hermès fragrance and think that's an Hermès fragrance. And I think that identity is maintained by having their in-house perfumers and by being independent brands. So I don't have a revenue figure for Chanel because I think they tend to report their entire business, which is far more than just fragrance. But we do know that Chanel report that they sell, I think it's something like 1 bottle of Chanel No. 5 every 30 seconds across the world. So if you extrapolate that to all their other fragrances, clearly they are getting a lot of revenue from their fragrance business. And for Hermès, I do have a revenue number, but it's for both their perfume and their beauty business. But I think, again, probably their perfume makes up the bulk of this figure. So the figure is 489 million euros. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have enjoyed it, then please do press the like button, and please also consider subscribing if you haven't done already. And please do let me know if you found anything surprising about this video. If you found out that a particular perfume brand that you love was linked to other perfume brands. Is it something that you've perhaps noticed that you think there's a bit of a resemblance between different perfume brands owned by the same perfume conglomerate? I'd love to hear people's answers on that. And also, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.